In 2002, a father watched his 2-year-old daughter die in his arms, and then the state of Texas decided he was the one who killed her. Robert Leslie Robertson III never screamed, never cried, never broke down the way a grieving parent should. And that silence, that eerie calm in the face of unimaginable loss, would become the very evidence used to send him to death row. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe so you never miss stories like this. The question that haunts this case is not just whether Robert Roberson killed his daughter. It is whether we, as a society, can recognize grief when it does not look the way we expect it to. Whether we can see innocence in a man who does not perform his pain for us. Whether we can admit that sometimes the monsters we create are not the people in the courtroom, but the systems that put them there. Robert Roberson was not like other fathers. He never had been. Born in the 1960s, he grew up different in ways that no one could quite name back then. He struggled to make eye contact. He spoke in flat, monotone sentences. Social cues that came naturally to others were foreign languages he never learned to speak. His emotions, when they surfaced at all, seemed disconnected from the moments that should have triggered them. In another era, with different knowledge, someone might have recognized the signs of autism spectrum disorder. But in rural Texas in the late 20th century, Robert was simply labeled as odd, slow, difficult. He drifted through life on the margins. He worked when he could find work. He struggled with relationships, with understanding the unspoken rules that governed human connection. And then, somehow against all odds, he became a father. His daughter, Nikki, was born in 2000. She was small, fragile, prone to illness. Robert loved her in the only way he knew how, a quiet, steady presence that did not announce itself with grand gestures or emotional displays. Would you have recognized his love if you saw it? Or would you have seen only the absence of what you expected love to look like? On the night of January 31st, 2002, Nikki was sick. She had been sick before many times. Respiratory infections, fevers, the constant vulnerability of a child whose immune system seemed perpetually overwhelmed. Robert had taken her to the doctor, to the emergency room, seeking help for ailments that never quite resolved. That night she had a fever. She was lethargic, unresponsive in ways that terrified him. He did what he thought was right. He gave her medication, he put her to bed. He checked on her throughout the night. By morning she would not wake up. Robert called for help. Paramedics arrived to find Nikki unconscious, her small body limp and unresponsive. They rushed her to the hospital in Palestine, Texas, where doctors worked frantically to save her life. But the damage was already done. Nikki Curtis was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. She was 2 years old, 3 months, and 11 days. And then the questions began. The medical examiner who performed the autopsy found bleeding in Nikki's brain, bleeding in her eyes, and what appeared to be bruising on her body. To the doctors who examined her, the pattern was unmistakable. They had seen it before, in training, in textbooks, in the grim parade of cases that filled pediatric emergency rooms across the country. Subdural hematoma, retinal hemorrhaging. The triad of symptoms that, according to medical consensus at the time, could mean only one thing: shaken baby syndrome. The diagnosis was delivered with certainty, with the weight of medical authority behind it. Someone had violently shaken this child, causing her brain to slam against the inside of her skull, tearing blood vessels, inflicting catastrophic damage. And the person who had been alone with Nikki in the hours before her collapse was her father. Robert Roberson was arrested and charged with capital murder. Do you think the doctors were wrong? Or do you think they saw what they were trained to see, regardless of what was actually there? The case against Robert Roberson was built on a foundation that seemed unshakable at the time. Shaken baby syndrome was accepted science, testified to by expert witnesses in courtrooms across America. The theory held that the specific combination of brain bleeding, retinal hemorrhaging, and subdural hematoma could only result from violent shaking or impact. No other explanation was medically possible. If a child presented with these symptoms, someone had abused that child. It was that simple. But there was another piece of evidence that prosecutors found even more damning than the medical findings. Robert Roberson himself. In the hours and days after Nikki's death, Robert did not behave the way a grieving father should. He did not weep uncontrollably. He did not rage against the injustice of losing his child. He did not collapse in despair. Instead, he remained calm, almost detached. He answered questions in a flat, emotionless voice. He showed little visible reaction to the news of his daughter's death. To the investigators who interviewed him, to the prosecutors who would later present his behavior to a jury, this lack of emotion was not a symptom of shock or neurodivergence. It was evidence of guilt. Only a monster, they reasoned, could remain so unmoved by the death of his own child. Only someone who had caused that death could fail to grieve in a recognizable way. The trial began in 2003. Robert Robertson sat in the courtroom, his face a mask of incomprehension as expert after expert took the stand to explain how his daughter had died. Pediatricians testified about the unmistakable signs of shaken baby syndrome. Forensic pathologists described the injuries in clinical detail. Child abuse specialists explained that these injuries could not have occurred accidentally, could not have resulted from a shortfall or natural illness. The prosecution painted a picture of a father overwhelmed by the demands of caring for a chronically ill child, a man whose frustration had boiled over into violence. They pointed to Robert's history of seeking medical care for Nikki as evidence not of concern but of a pattern. Perhaps he had been hurting her all along. Perhaps the final fatal shaking was just the culmination of months of abuse. And then they pointed to Robert himself, sitting silently at the defense table, his face betraying no emotion, no remorse, no humanity that the jury could recognize. Would you have convicted him? If you had been in that jury box, watching this strange, silent man who showed no grief for his dead daughter, what would you have believed? The defense tried to argue that Nikki's death could have been caused by natural illness, by the chronic respiratory infections and fevers that had plagued her throughout her short life. They suggested that the medications Robert had given her, combined with her existing health problems, might have contributed to her collapse. But their experts were outnumbered, outmatched by the certainty of the prosecution's medical witnesses. And they had no answer for Robert's demeanor. How could they explain to a jury that this man's flat affect, his lack of visible emotion, was not evidence of guilt, but a neurological difference he had lived with his entire life? How could they make 12 strangers understand that grief does not always look like crying, that love does not always announce itself with the gestures we expect? The jury deliberated for less than a day. They found Robert Robertson guilty of capital murder. The judge sentenced him to death. Robert was sent to death row in Texas, where he would spend the next 2 decades waiting to die for a crime that, increasingly, experts believe he did not commit. Because something was changing in the medical community. Something that would call into question everything the jury had been told about how Nikki Curtis died. The science of shaken baby syndrome was beginning to crumble. In the years following Robert's conviction, researchers started to question the certainty with which the diagnosis had been applied. They discovered that the triad of symptoms, subdural hematoma, retinal hemorrhaging, and brain swelling, could be caused by things other than violent shaking. Shortfalls, previously dismissed as incapable of causing such injuries, were found to be more dangerous than believed. Medical conditions, infections, blood disorders, metabolic problems could produce symptoms that mimicked abuse. The diagnosis that had seemed so clear, so scientifically unassailable, was revealed to be far more complex and uncertain than anyone had admitted in courtrooms across the country. Doctors who had testified in hundreds of cases, who had sent dozens of parents and caregivers to prison based on their certainty about shaken baby syndrome, began to recant. Medical journals published studies questioning the validity of the diagnosis. Innocence projects took up cases of people convicted solely on the basis of this now disputed science. And in Texas, Robert Robertson continued to sit on death row, his execution date approaching, while the evidence that had convicted him fell apart piece by piece. Do you think the system will admit its mistake? Or do you think it is easier to execute a man than to acknowledge that the science was wrong? In 2024, a group of doctors, scientists, and advocates began to take a closer look at Robert Robertson's case. What they found was deeply disturbing. Nikki Curtis had not been a healthy child who was suddenly and violently injured. She had been chronically ill, with a documented history of respiratory problems, fevers, and infections. In the days before her death, she had been prescribed medications that, in combination, could have suppressed her breathing and contributed to her collapse. Medical records that had been overlooked or dismissed at trial told a different story than the one the jury had heard. Nikki had pneumonia at the time of her death. She had been given medications that were later found to be dangerous for young children. The symptoms that doctors had attributed to violent shaking could have been caused by a combination of illness, medication, and the body's response to oxygen deprivation. Robert Robertson had not killed his daughter. He had watched her die from causes he could not understand or prevent. And then he had been punished for failing to grieve in a way that satisfied the people judging him. But proving innocence is far harder than proving guilt. The legal system is not designed to easily reverse convictions, especially in capital cases. Courts are reluctant to second-guess juries, to admit that the experts who testified were wrong, that the science was flawed, that an innocent man has been sitting on death row for 20 years. Robert's lawyers filed motion after motion, presenting new evidence, new expert testimony, new scientific understanding of the injuries that had killed Nikki. They argued that Robert's autism, undiagnosed at the time of trial, explained his flat affect and lack of emotional display. They showed that he had been a caring father who had repeatedly sought medical help for his sick daughter. The courts denied the motions. The conviction stood. An execution date was set for October 16, 2025. Would you have fought for him? Or would you have assumed that the system, with all its checks and balances, must have gotten it right? As the execution date approached, something unprecedented happened. A bipartisan group of Texas lawmakers, people who rarely agreed on anything, came together to fight for Robert Roberson's life. They were joined by medical experts, by the lead detective who had investigated Nikki's death and now believed Robert was innocent, by advocates who had spent years studying wrongful convictions based on flawed science. They argued that Texas law required courts to consider new scientific evidence that could exonerate a convicted person. They pointed to the overwhelming consensus among medical experts that shaken baby syndrome, as it had been understood in 2002, was not reliable science. They demanded that Robert be given a new trial, one where the jury could hear the full truth about how Nikki had died. The state fought back. Prosecutors argued that the conviction was sound, that the new evidence was not compelling enough to overturn a jury's verdict. They maintained that Robert Robertson had killed his daughter, that the medical evidence still supported that conclusion, that his lack of emotion still indicated guilt. The clock ticked down. Days became hours. Robert Robertson prepared to die. And then, in September 2025, just weeks before the scheduled execution, a court issued an emergency stay. Robert would not die on October 16th. He would be given more time, more opportunity for his lawyers to present the evidence that had been ignored for so long. But the stay was temporary. The fight was not over. Robert Robertson remained on death row, his fate still uncertain, his life still hanging in the balance of a legal system that struggles to admit its mistakes. The question that haunts this case is not just about one man's guilt or innocence. It is about how we decide who deserves to live and who deserves to die. It is about the certainty we demand from science, even when science itself is uncertain. It is about the assumptions we make about how people should behave, how they should grieve, how they should love. Robert Robertson did not cry when his daughter died. He did not perform his pain in a way that satisfied the people watching him. And for that, he was sentenced to death. How many other people are sitting in prisons right now, convicted not because of what they did, but because of who they are? How many have been judged not by the evidence, but by their failure to conform to expectations of how a guilty or innocent person should act? The case of Robert Robertson forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, about science, about the ways we decide who is human enough to deserve mercy. It asks us whether we are willing to admit when we are wrong, even when that admission comes at the cost of acknowledging that we nearly killed an innocent man. Robert sits in his cell, waiting. The legal battles continue. The science evolves. The understanding of what happened to Nikki Curtis becomes clearer with each passing year. But the question remains, will it be enough? Will the system that convicted him be willing to set him free? Or will the machinery of death, once set in motion, be too difficult to stop? And if Robert Robertson is executed, if the state of Texas carries out his sentence despite the overwhelming evidence of his innocence, what does that say about all of us? About the justice we claim to seek, the truth we claim to value, the humanity we claim to possess? The answer to that question may be more terrifying than anything Robert Robertson ever did or did not do. Because it suggests that sometimes the real horror is not in the actions of individuals, but in the cold, bureaucratic machinery that grinds forward regardless of truth, regardless of evidence, regardless of the human lives it destroys. Robert Robertson loved his daughter. He could not save her from the illness that killed her. And now, he cannot save himself from a system that has decided his silence is proof of his guilt. Do you think he will survive this? Or do you think some injustices are too deeply embedded to ever be undone?